and what I do in the class, and this recording will be made available. One, it'll be in Teams. You can see a link to it in Teams, but as well, you'll see later on this afternoon a link to it right on our class website. So you can click on it there as well if you need the video. Okay. So as of yesterday, I showed you guys like the code we wrote, and actually, let me take a second today to show you that if we didn't do any comments, like if there was no comments in our example, you'd actually see how much code we actually have typed in this example, and it isn't much, okay? So I'm just gonna, my computer's a little sluggish, but I'm gonna just take a second to remove all the comments from what we've done so far in this example. This will not take long. Okay, so if we hadn't put comments in our example, all it would look like so far is that we have these two global variables, and we did that later in the example. We have this reading of text from a text box and storing it in a variable, the start of writing an if statement, and then we also did the else statement. And inside the if statement are two lines of code. One you've seen before, application.exit. One we've now talked a little bit more about, this message box code. And then inside the else, it's just, again, converting a piece of text into a number, and then doing a little bit of a formula with those numbers, and then outputting that number into a label, okay? Once I put the comments back in, once I undo back and get all those comments back in, the reason for the comments was to help explain the concepts of this example, that these are the global variables, that this is the beginning of an if statement and what is involved with an if statement. So that's all there for you. Now, if you're struggling a little bit, then definitely the comments will help. I'd like to point out as well, as I pointed out yesterday, that on our class, you can go to the page called Examples, where you can find conditional statements part 1, the same example, where you can find just the code for the example. So if I was to click that, just the code, I'll get to that one in a second, or the example itself, it does go through the example step by step. Examples are not for marks, so I'm never going to know if you don't do it or not. But I do want to make that point again. The reason I feel examples are so important is, to me, that's how you learn computer science. I mean, I could assign you guys readings, like, hey, read this chapter of this book. It'll teach you about conditional statements. I would guess that, like you, I was the kind of student where that didn't really make that big a difference. Now, if you are that kind of student, if you do like reading a bunch of stuff, then you can certainly go back and read the content section about conditional statements. You can go in about conditional statements, you can go to unit content, and everything you need to read about it is there, right? You can go to part 1, you can read ahead to part 2 if you're kind of ambitious. You can read it in its PowerPoint format, you can read it, watch the video if you don't really want to read. You can read it right off the web page. It explains it in detail. But to me, I learn better through actually doing stuff, through kinesthetic learning, by activating my actual muscles and by actually doing something about it. So that's why having the example, to me, not just for you guys, but actually participating in the example, will really help you to learn kind of how this thing called coding, this weird sort of symbolic thing, can connect to making the computer do what you want it to do, okay? All right, so now back to this example. So what we finished with yesterday was incorporating not just an if statement, but also incorporating the word else into our coding. And the way I again put it is else now works for both true and false. So if something's true, it does one piece of code. Otherwise, it does another piece of code. Instead of using the word otherwise, the coding uses the word else. So if else basically creates a switch, meaning, and I'll just diagram it on here again today. What the switch essentially means is there's this test right here to check to see if something's true. If it is true, it runs this block of code. And if it's not true, then it runs this block of code. This block of code is when the test is false. This block of code right here is for when the code is true. And those blocks of code are based on this test or this condition right here. Condition says, I'm going to test this code. And if it's true, I'm going to go run this block of code. But if it's false, I'm going to go run this block of code. An else statement is optional. You don't have to write an else statement. Okay, so what I want to do today is I want to then also incorporate our other button called count values. So I'd like you to double click that button. And we're going to write another if statement in this button, but just an if statement, no else statement. Okay, yeah. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to create here a simple if. Okay, so just the word if, no else with this. Skills aren't great. To check or to test that at least one number has been entered. Because if we're going to click a button that says, I'm going to count how many numbers are entered, at least one of them should have been entered. Otherwise, the answer, of course, is going to be 0. But I'm going to make a check. I'm going to make sure that they've entered at least one number. And I'm going to do that by writing an if statement. If. Now, writing an if statement for the second time, you'll remember that it's the keyword if and that there's sets of brackets. Starting with the round brackets, you then create a test. If the count is one of our global variables. You might remember we made them yesterday. Count is a global variable used to count how many, which is exactly what I'm counting here. I'm counting how many numbers have been entered. If the count is greater than or equal to 1. So this is the test I'm creating. I'm using that mathematical symbol, greater than, whoops, wrong one. Greater than or equal to. That's how you draw it in math class. But in computer science, we draw it this way because we're typing it. But I also need the curly brackets. Those two curly brackets define a block of code that will be controlled by this if statement. So only if it's true will it enter this block of code. And for this block of code, I'm going to use the message box code again. Message box, you can see it will help you write this code. It's spelled in a specific way with a capital M and a capital B. That style of writing again called camel casing. But as it pops up, you can just hit enter, dot, show. And then here's something I find a lot of students screw up about message box. Don't screw it up, but it's an easy mistake to make. They then put an equal sign, but message box doesn't use the equal sign. It uses round brackets and then quotation marks. And whatever you put in the quotation marks is what you want to have show up. So what I want to have show up is the words you have entered plus count plus values, closing quote. Now we've seen this in the last unit, but what I'm doing here is I'm saying take this little piece of text right here. And then also take this little piece of text right here. However, this thing is a variable, okay? A variable is going to have something stored inside of it. Some number is going to be stored in there. So it's going to take these words, okay, and this word and that number and join them together. Even though I'm using a plus sign there, it's not adding them, it's joining them all together. So let me show you how this works. If I run this, okay, and I'm going to intentionally enter a score, or enter a number, pardon me, see, I said the word score. That's a hint that this example is connected to the first assignment. You'll see later when I explain the assignments. It's not a score, it's just a number, okay? I also made the design a little bit smaller since yesterday's class because I thought it was maybe a little too big, but still big text, but I made the design a little smaller. If it ever shows up. Come on, computer. Taking a sip of coffee, he waits. Well, since I'm waiting, you now can, oh, there it is. Okay, so here it is. I'm going to enter a value, 12, enter. So you might remember yesterday, it keeps a sum of it down here. If I enter another number, 20, now it's added 20 plus 12. But now when I click this button, it tells me that I've entered two values, which makes sense. I have entered two values. But I'm going to start this program over again. Okay, so from scratch, and I'm going to click count values before I enter any values. And notice nothing happens. It doesn't show that message box. And that's because it hasn't passed this test. So this line of code, this block of code, is controlled by the if statement. It will not run. Okay? So this is an example of a simple if statement without all the comments all kind of crowded around it. So you can see that. Okay? So speaking of crowding, I'm now going to enter the last piece of this example. Okay, the last thing to do about it. I do want to take a look at this checklist. Okay, so now that you've seen what an else is, I feel like I can also check off the last thing I wanted to teach you. How do if and else go together? But I want to finalize that here in a second by putting in the last piece of code of our example. And for this, I'd like you to double click the checkbox. We haven't been looking at this checkbox, but it's down here. So although it's not a button, I can still code a checkbox to do stuff. So I want you to double click the checkbox and we're going to enter code. And the code says when this checkbox changes, which means it's changing from checked to unchecked or from unchecked to checked. So what we're going to do is we are going to make a decision. Okay? If the checkbox is checked, is it checked? Okay? Or not? Is it checked off or not? Okay, that's what we're going to make a decision about. Okay? If it is, then make the label visible. Otherwise, we now know means else, make label not visible, or in other words, invisible. So we're going to make the label visible or invisible depending on whether they have it checked or not checked. That's me writing it in my own words rather than worrying about code at this point. But even writing it in my own words, I start to see the words that show up in code. Words like if, words like checked, and the name of the checkbox, which is right here. I can see that the word else and visible are going to start to show up in my code. So I'm already seeing words in my own thoughts that are going to show up in code. All right, so let's put the code. If. So what am I checking? Well, I'm checking if this checkbox that I've called CHK CSUM, that's the name of my checkbox. I can't just say the name of the checkbox. I have to dig down a little deeper. What about the checkbox? Well, dot, which is one of its properties, checked. So has this checkbox been checked? What I need to say is, does this equal true? Now, to show you how this piece of written code relates to the designer, if we were using the designer and we were using that properties window, we would have gone to a property called checked and set it to be true so that the little check mark appeared there. If we set that property to false right here, then we would have seen it's not checked. So what we're doing is writing in code right here, kind of what we did with the designer. Although with an if statement, we're going to use the double equal sign. Okay, now there's more to this. I need my curly brackets. Okay, so what do? Well, then what I do is I take my label called output dot visible and I make that into true. So the label will become visible if it's checked off. Pretty simple now if you've been understanding if statements, how that works. But we're also going to put an else onto this. Now you might remember, I mentioned this yesterday, else comes after the closing curly bracket because it has its own block of code. This is the else block. This is the if block. Both of these are controlled by those curly brackets. What am I going to put in its else block? Well, the exact same line, LBL output dot visible equals false. So in one case it's true and in one case it's false. And let's see how that works. So when I run this, I check it and uncheck it, and the answer either appears or it doesn't appear. Now again, I can still do all the other things. I can enter a bunch of scores. I can see them or not see them, and I can count how many I've entered. And that completes the example. Okay, so that's all the code and all the comments of that example. And again, if you want them, you can also get them right off of my website. They're there already. Okay, so that got us ahead of schedule, way ahead of schedule. It's not even 2:30 yet, everybody. So what I want to do now is just go over some of the work that's coming up in this unit. Okay, I've kind of already previewed it a little bit, but I want to kind of relate this now to how you guys are going to get to work. And I'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow. So I promise, only a couple minutes of talking. All right, so now when you guys go in, and let me just close these other tabs. Go in to work on an assignment for this unit, conditional statements. Having now completed the first example, you can expect that you could be able to now do the first two programming problems. The other two will be after we do the second example, okay? Because there'll be stuff that I'm expecting in those that we haven't learned yet. At any point, you could also do the case study. Now, the case study you can do at any point because I just give you all the code. However, in the case study, expect to see code that you haven't learned yet. But that's okay. It's okay to take a peek ahead. It's an example, right? It's an example for marks. Sometimes by doing the case study, it might give you clues to do some of the programming problems. So now with these two programming problems, I kind of have previewed those Monday and Tuesday with you guys. The first programming problem involves this program that kind of figures out what your average is, okay, based on the scores you enter. But notice there's a very important hint in this one. The example we did in class has a lot of clues in it. I even slipped that when we started today. I said, oh, the test score. No, it's not the test score, it was the number. Well, that shows you that a lot of the code you're using in this first example will repeat itself in that in this first programming problem, okay? When you get to the second programming problem, maybe is a few things that would show up in there. But remember, in the second programming problem, most of the hints for this one are on the second page. I give a ton of hints here on how to approach that second programming problem. Remember, you can try these things if you want. Go to demonstrations and try them out, okay? And like the last two units, there is another video that you guys can try that'll give you guidance to help you give you even further hints. Let me just play a snippet of that video right now. Actually, I'll just mute it. You guys don't need to hear this video. In this video, you'll see I basically say the same thing I just said to you guys. Here's where the hints are, et cetera, et cetera. I'll just pause this for a second. You might also want to get hints, as it says here, from this presentation. This is the presentation I'd normally run when you guys are working on a work day here in class. But since that's not the case, you're on remote learning, you can go ahead and open that at home. And it has all the hints from the first couple units, like how to make things visible and invisible, how to make variables, how to make more variables. And then right here are some hints for conditional statements. Notice this says this might be good on conditional statements problem 2, okay? And that maybe you could use some of this on problem 1 and 2. And then you could go a little further and says here, oh, 2 global variables. I bet you're going to need this in problem 1 of this unit. And then go a little further and it says, oh, look, here's this thing called an else. You might need that in problem 1, but not this line. This line you won't need, right? You don't need that line in there. So the hints are going to be there for you. And you can go to this video, like I said, and I'll go a little bit further ahead, where I actually do put in a lot of the code, okay? So that it does take you through, it walks you through, sorry. Yeah, it walks you through, get it? It walks you through how to do a lot of the problems in that unit. And then it does go on to give hints for some of the other ones as well. Okay, so again, not all of them, but some of them, right? So that is a 30-minute guidance video, but you don't need to watch all 30 minutes, just the parts that are relevant to the assignments you're working on. Whew, okay, it is 2:30. I am almost exactly on the timeline I said I was going to be with you guys. In a minute, I'm going to turn off the video and create a link to it for this class. Thank you guys for your diligent attendance here on Teams today. I was going to do one last check for the couple students who I had marked absent. And no, it was just the 2 students, no, 3, pardon me. And no, I didn't see them show up. So guys, I will stay on Teams from now until 2:50 when the period's over. You do not need to stay on Teams anymore unless you have questions or need help with anything. I realize some of you, again, have technical issues, which I'll try to help with as much as possible. And as well, I'll be available at 3 o'clock for extra help if any of you need that. It was a nice day out, but it did start to rain a few minutes ago, but rain is nice too. So enjoy your day, guys. Just real quick, my general expectations for you guys for this week, these 3 days, is what you guys have been doing to try and get things up and running at your house, okay? I really don't expect you guys to be handing stuff in this week. It's okay if you are. It's okay if you are doing work and handing it in. But by next week, hopefully all your technical issues will be kind of ironed out. And by Monday of next week, then you can kind of have a little more of a quote unquote normal class that you can work on assignments for my course and get them eventually handed in, okay? But as far as today and tomorrow goes, I don't really expect to see much showing up in my hand-in box, but that's good if it does. Also, for those of you who are still working on previous units, like the variables unit or units before that, you can still do that as well and still hand that in, and I'm still available for helping on all that. All right, guys, turn off my screen share so you guys can see me. All right. Have a good day, everybody. And for those staying on the line, I'm here to answer any of your technical questions. And for those who aren't, I'll see you tomorrow.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
So, just because it wasn't talked over for this one, for something that I'm wanting to try out, for the conditional statement, is there some